The ocean never sleeps, and neither do the storms that prowl its endless waters. For over 3 centuries, pirates sailed these same seas where hurricanes are born, where typhoons rage with biblical fury, and where the difference between life and death often came down to a single knot tied correctly in the darkness. This isn't romanticized adventure, sailing through gentle Caribbean breezes. This is the story of how criminals and outcasts became masters of survival, how they read the sky like scripture and prepared for storms that could swallow entire fleets. From typhoon-battered junks of Chinese pirates to hurricane-hammered sloops of Caribbean buccaneers, we'll explore the techniques that kept pirate crews alive when the sea turned murderous. If you find yourself drawn to these dark tales of survival and the sea, consider liking this video and subscribing to Bedtime History. We explore the shadows of the past, one haunting story at a time. Close your eyes and listen to the wind. The storm is coming. Chapter 1. Into the maelstrom. The barometer is falling like a stone dropped into deep water, and Captain Bartholomew Roberts knows what that means. The Glass sits in his cabin aboard Royal Fortune, its mercury dropping with the relentless certainty of approaching doom. Outside his stern windows, the Caribbean sky has turned the color of old brass, and the wind carries a taste that every experienced sailor knows, the metallic tang of violence brewing in the heavens. You're a member of Robert's crew, and you can feel it in your bones before you see in the sky. The ship's motion has changed from the steady roll of normal seas to something more urgent, more erratic. The waves are growing confused, coming from multiple directions as competing pressure systems wrestle for dominance above your head. Your skin feels electric, tingling with the static charge building in the atmosphere like gunpowder waiting for a spark. This is how storms announce themselves to those who know how to listen. Not with thunder and lightning. Those come later, when it's too late to prepare. The first warnings arrive as whispers in the rigging, subtle changes in wind direction, and that peculiar stillness that settles over the water like a held breath. The seabirds have vanished, seeking shelter on distant shores they can sense but you cannot see. Even the dolphins have disappeared, diving deep beneath the surface where the coming chaos cannot reach them. The crew moves with practiced efficiency born from watching too many good men die when preparation came too slow. Every pirate ship that survived more than a season carried sailors who understood that the sea offered no mercy to the unprepared. These men had learned their lessons in blood and salt water, watching vessels founder and break apart when captains ignored the warnings or crews panicked when the wind began to scream. Roberts himself stands on the quarterdeck, his weathered face reading the sky like a battle plan. Black Bart didn't become the most successful pirate captain in history by ignoring nature's signals. He captured over 400 ships during his career, but his greatest victories weren't won with cannon and cutlass. They were won by keeping his crew alive when other captains lost theirs to the sea's fury. The storm approaching isn't an enemy he can defeat with superior firepower or tactical brilliance. It's a force that demands respect, preparation, and the kind of seamanship that separated living pirates from dead ones. The wind shifts again, and now you can smell it clearly, that distinctive scent of rain mixed with ozone and something else, something primal that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The horizon has darkened to a line of bruised purple, and flickers of lightning dance within the distant clouds like demons playing with fire. The storm is still hours away, but its breath already reaches across the water, sending long swells rolling beneath Royal Fortune's hull with increasing urgency. Modern meteorology didn't exist in the golden age of piracy. There were no weather satellites, no hurricane tracking systems, no radio warnings broadcast from shore. Pirates relied on knowledge passed down through generations of sailors who had survived what others couldn't. They watched cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts. Their lives depended on reading signs that landlubbers couldn't even perceive. The air pressure continues dropping, and you feel it in your ears, a subtle popping sensation that tells you the storm is strengthening as it approaches. Experienced sailors sometimes felt approaching weather and old injuries, broken bones that ached before storms, scars that tingled when pressure dropped. The human body, these men learned, could be as sensitive as any barometer when properly attuned to the sea's moods. Roberts calls for all hands, his voice carrying easily across the deck despite the rising wind. This is the moment when survival begins. Not when the storm arrives, but hours before, when there's still time to prepare, still opportunity to make the hundreds of small decisions that determine whether a ship rides out the tempest or becomes another ghost story told in waterfront taverns. The crew responds immediately, abandoning whatever tasks had occupied the moments before. Card games are forgotten, food left half-eaten, conversations cut short in mid-sentence. Every man knows his role in the choreography of storm preparation. Some head aloft to secure the rigging. Others disappear below to check the pumps and ensure the cargo is properly secured. The ship's carpenter inspects every plank and joint he can reach, looking for signs of weakness that the storm might exploit. The cook banks his fires and secures everything in the galley that might become a projectile when the ship begins her violent dance with the waves. You can see the storm clearly now, a wall of darkness stretching across the southern horizon like a curtain being drawn across the world. Lightning flickers within its depths, and though the thunder hasn't reached you yet, you know it will soon enough. The sea itself seems to anticipate what's coming. Waves that were white-capped and playful an hour ago now march in long, dark rows toward your position, each one larger than the last. The temperature drops suddenly, and the wind that had been warm and tropical now carries a chill that cuts through your shirt and raises goosebumps on sun-darkened skin. This is another warning sign that experienced sailors recognize. Storms bring their own weather, cold air masses that collide with warm tropical air to create the violent mixing that feeds a hurricane's fury. The clash of hot and cold, wet and dry, creates the energy that will soon be unleashed upon anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in the open ocean. Roberts issues orders in the clipped, economical language of command at sea. Every word matters when wind begins to howl, and complex instructions must be communicated quickly and clearly. The crew responds with the fluid precision of men who have rehearsed these movements in their sleep, because in many ways they have. Storm preparation was drilled into pirate crews until it became instinct, muscle memory that functioned even when fear and exhaustion clouded judgment. The first fat raindrops splatter against the deck, each one the size of a coin and warm as blood. They're scouts from the army marching toward you, advanced messengers of the deluge to come. Within minutes, those isolated drops will become a steady shower, then a driving rain, then a liquid wall that makes breathing difficult and visibility impossible. But for now, in these last precious moments of preparation, you can still see clearly, still move freely, still make the choices that will determine whether you live to see another sunrise. The storm is no longer approaching. It has arrived. The edge of its power brushes against royal fortune like a giant's finger testing the resistance of a toy ship. The real violence still waits on the horizon, but already you can feel the sea changing beneath you, waves growing steeper and more chaotic as the storm's energy transfers into the water. This is your last warning, the final signal that the time for preparation is ending and the time for survival is about to begin. The barometer has stopped falling, not because the storm has weakened, but because it has reached its full terrible potential. The mercury sits at the bottom of the glass tube like a lead weight, and Roberts closes the instruments case with the finality of a man sealing a coffin. There's nothing more the glass can tell him now except what he already knows. They're about to face nature at her most violent, and their only weapons are skill, courage, and the hope that their ship can endure what the sea is about to unleash upon them. Chapter 2. Reading the Devil's Weather. The morning sky bleeds red above the South China Sea, and Shi Yang knows that blood-red sunrise means blood will be spilled before the day ends. The legendary pirate Empress stands on the deck of her flagship, surrounded by 80,000 pirates spread across hundreds of junks, all waiting for her command. But today, her enemy isn't the Imperial Navy or rival pirate confederation. It's the sky itself, which has been sending warnings for 3 days to those wise enough to read them. You're a junior captain in Shi Yang's Red Flag fleet, and you've been watching the signs as carefully as your commander. The swells rolling beneath your junk's hull have been growing longer and more powerful since dawn, even though no wind drives them. These are the storm swells, waves born hundreds of miles away where typhoons spawn in the deep Pacific and sent racing ahead like messengers carrying news of approaching catastrophe. Your weathered hands feel the ship's motion change as these deep-water giants pass beneath her keel. 3 days ago, the sunset painted the western sky in shades of green and yellow, colors that old sailors call the devil's palette. When the sun sets in those hues, wise captains prepare for weather that can crack a ship's spine like kindling. Yesterday, the morning brought mare's tails. High, wispy clouds stretched across the sky like a horse's mane flowing in wind too high for earthbound creatures to feel. These clouds form in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, where typhoons first announce their presence to those who know the language of the heavens. The air itself carries warnings that landsmen cannot perceive, but sailors learn to read like scripture. Yesterday evening, the wind died completely just after sunset, leaving the fleet becalmed and water smooth as polished jade. But this wasn't peaceful stillness. It was the ominous quiet that comes when competing air masses collide and cancel each other out. The calm before nature unleashes her fury upon the sea. Experienced sailors call it the devil's calm, and it never lasts long. Chinese pirates developed weather prediction into an art form more sophisticated than anything Europeans possessed during the same period. Generations of sailing the typhoon-prone waters of the South China Sea had taught them to recognize subtle atmospheric changes that could mean the difference between profit and death. They watched cloud formations with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts, because the clouds told stories of wind and rain that would arrive long before the storm itself became visible. The seabirds began their exodus yesterday afternoon, streaming westward toward the mainland in long, ragged lines that darken the sky like smoke. Gulls, petrels, and storm shearwaters, birds that normally fed fearlessly in the roughest seas, abandoned their hunting grounds and fled for the safety of inland roosts. When seabirds flee, experienced sailors know that conditions too violent for creatures born to the storm are approaching across the water. Shi Yang's weathermaster, an ancient sailor whose face looks like cracked leather and whose eyes have watched 1,000 storms, points toward the eastern horizon where a faint haze shimmers in the morning light. To untrained observers, it might appear to be ordinary morning mist, but the old man's experienced gaze recognizes it as the dust cloud kicked up by winds so powerful they lift sand from distant shores and carry it hundreds of miles across the ocean. When you can taste desert sand in the sea air, the typhoon's outer edge is less than a day away. The water temperature has been rising steadily, another warning sign that speaks to those fluent in the ocean's language. Typhoons feed on warm water like fire feeds on dry wood, and the massive low-pressure system approaching has been sucking heat from the sea surface, creating a thermal dome that spreads outward from the storm's eye. Fish behavior changes when water temperatures shift suddenly. Schools that normally fed near the surface dive deep, seeking the cooler, more stable conditions found in the depths. Your junk's rigging sings with a particular note that every sailor learns to recognize and fear. It's not the healthy whistle of wind through rope and canvas, but a higher, more urgent keening that occurs when air pressure drops rapidly. The hemp and bamboo rigging responds to atmospheric changes like a massive musical instrument, and the song it sings now speaks of violence building beyond the horizon. The sound makes your teeth ache and your pulse quicken with primordial recognition of approaching danger. Dolphins have been absent from the fleet's wake for 2 days, another ominous sign that experienced sailors read like an obituary. These intelligent mammals possess senses that humans lack, able to detect pressure changes and electrical disturbances that precede major storms. When dolphins disappear from waters they normally frequent, it means they've sensed conditions that their instincts warn them to avoid. Pirates who ignored such warnings often found themselves fighting for their lives, while the creatures they dismissed as mere fish swam safely in distant waters. The morning brought another unmistakable warning, a double sunrise caused by atmospheric distortion as the storm's massive low-pressure system bends light rays across impossible distances. For a few minutes, 2 suns appeared to rise from the eastern horizon, one real and one a reflection created by the typhoon's towering wall of clouds still hidden below the Earth's curve. Ancient Chinese sailors considered this phenomenon a certain harbinger of weather violent enough to sink entire fleets. Shi Yang's fleet includes weather specialists whose sole responsibility is reading the sky and see for signs of approaching storms. These men don't navigate or fight. They observe, measuring wind direction with silk streamers, testing water temperature with their hands, watching cloud formations through pieces of tinted glass that reduce glare and reveal subtle color, changes invisible to the naked eye. Their knowledge, passed down through generations of sailors who survived what others couldn't, forms a comprehensive system of weather prediction that rival anything developed by land-based meteorologists. The barometric pressure, though unmeasured by instruments, makes itself known through physical symptoms that every experienced sailor recognizes. Headaches, joint pain, and a peculiar restlessness that drives men to pace the deck without purpose. All signs that the atmosphere above is undergoing violent changes. Some sailors claim they can predict storm severity by how badly their old injuries ache when pressure drops, treating their own bodies as living barometers calibrated by years of exposure to the sea's moods. Even the ship's rats have begun behaving strangely, abandoning their usual hiding places in the lower holds to cluster near the upper decks. Sailors have long known that rats possess an uncanny ability to sense approaching danger, often fleeing ships hours before disasters that human senses cannot yet detect. When the rats grow restless and seek higher ground, wise captains begin their storm preparations regardless of what the sky appears to promise. The final warning comes as the wind shifts direction 3 times in an hour, backing against the sun in the circular pattern that indicates a massive rotating storm system approaching from the east. This isn't the random shifting of typical weather patterns, but the methodical progression of wind direction that occurs when a typhoon's outer circulation begins to influence local conditions. Each shift brings the wind from a different quadrant, following the mathematical precision of the storm's spiral arms as they reach across hundreds of miles of ocean. Shi Yang raises her hand, and 80,000 pirates begin preparing for battle, not against human enemies, but against nature herself at her most violent. The signs have been read, the warnings heeded, and now survival depends on the preparations made in these last precious hours before the typhoon arrives to test every lesson learned in a lifetime of dancing with death on the South China Sea. Chapter 3. Storm-Rigged Ships. The hammering begins before dawn aboard HMS Royal Fortune as Bartholomew Roberts' crew transforms their predator into prey. Every piece of equipment that makes a pirate ship deadly in battle now becomes a liability when facing nature's artillery. Gun ports must be sealed watertight, cannons lashed down with chains thick enough to anchor a cathedral, and the very weapons that made them masters of the Caribbean secured against the storm that cares nothing for their reputation. You are the ship's carpenter, and your hands move with practiced precision despite the rising wind. The great guns present the most immediate danger. 18-pounders that served faithfully in battle against Spanish galleons now threaten to break loose and become 4,000-pound battering rams smashing through the ship's hull. Each cannon must be double-breeched, hauled back as far as their tackle will allow, and secured with additional ropes that would normally be considered excessive. Gun ports receive double thickness of tarred canvas, each piece overlapping like scales on some great sea serpent. Water force through openings by hurricane winds arrives with pressure that can cave in a man's chest. Above deck, the rigging receives obsessive attention. Standing rigging gets additional stays rigged at angles that would look ridiculous in fair weather, but become essential when wind speed exceeds anything the original designers contemplated. The sails pose a deadly paradox. Too much canvas exposed will rip the masts from their roots or capsize the ship entirely. Too little, and the vessel becomes uncontrollable, wallowing helplessly where breaking seas can roll her over. Pirates developed storm sailing techniques using jury-rigged sails and improvised rigging to maintain just enough control to survive conditions that would destroy properly rigged merchant vessels. Every loose object becomes a potential weapon. Sea chests must be lashed to ring bolts, cooking pots secured, water barrels chained. A pewter mug traveling at 20 miles per hour can crack a skull just as effectively as a cutlass blade. The galley fires present specialized dangers. The cook banks his fires with ashes and sand, creating smoldering coals that can be revived when conditions permit while minimizing fire risk. Below decks, heavy items like water barrels must be placed low to keep the ship's center of gravity stable. But they can't simply be piled. They must be distributed to prevent the ship from becoming top-heavy when water inevitably finds its way into lower compartments. Pirates learn to pack their holds like three-dimensional puzzles, each piece supporting its neighbors in mutual stability. The pump systems receive obsessive attention because they represent the difference between temporary discomfort and permanent residency on the ocean floor. Hand pumps, chain pumps, bucket brigades, and improvised bailers. Every method of removing water gets prepared and positioned for immediate use. As the final preparations complete, Royal Fortune has been transformed from predator into fortress, stripped of everything that made her dangerous and rebuilt to survive an enemy that cannot be defeated, only endured. Chapter 4. When the sky turns black. The horizon disappears, as if God himself has drawn a curtain across the world, and Captain Henry Morgan watches the wall of darkness advance toward Port Royal with the inevitability of Judgment Day. The great buccaneer stands on his quarterdeck, studying the approaching hurricane with the same calculating gaze he once turned upon Spanish treasure fleets. But this enemy cannot be boarded, cannot be intimidated, and shows no mercy to those who have shown none to others. You are Morgan's quartermaster, and you feel the first real gusts arrive like scouts from an advancing army. Palm trees along the Jamaican coast bend and thrash as if in agony, their fronds stripped away by invisible claws. The air has turned sickly yellow-green, the color of old brass tarnished by salt and time. Even hardened buccaneers who have burned cities watch the approaching storm with genuine fear. Barometric pressure drops, so low that men clutch their heads as stabbing pains lance through their skulls. The atmosphere presses down with crushing weight while seeming to suck air from your lungs. Breathing becomes difficult from the strange thinness that precedes violent storms. Your ears pop constantly, and some crews suffer nosebleeds from rapid atmospheric changes. The wind climbs from 20 to 30 to 40 knots with mathematical precision. Rigging that seemed substantial yesterday now vibrates like harp strings tuned beyond breaking point. The sound builds from whisper to moan to howl that drowns out human voices, making communication possible only through desperate gestures. Rain arrives not as drops, but as horizontal bullets driven by wind that treats gravity as negotiable suggestion. What begins as heavy shower becomes liquid wall, making breathing dangerous and visibility impossible beyond arm's length. The rain doesn't fall, it attacks, striking exposed skin with enough force to raise welts. The sea undergoes transformation that challenges everything experienced sailors know about ocean behavior. Waves grow confused and angry as competing wind patterns create chaos. White caps become white walls, spray becomes horizontal sheets, and the distinction between sea and sky blurs until the world becomes gray-green hell where up and down lose meaning. Temperature drops 15 degrees in 15 minutes as hurricane circulation draws cool air from upper atmosphere. This creates temperature gradients, spawning weather systems within the larger storm. Downdrafts that can push ships underwater, updrafts that lift men from decks, horizontal wind shears that snap masts like twigs. Visibility deteriorates until crew members 30 feet apart might as well be on different continents. The storm creates its own night, blocking sun so completely that noon looks like midnight. Emergency lanterns gutter and die, leaving crews to work by touch when sight becomes useless. Communication between ships becomes impossible as the fleet scatters across miles of chaotic ocean. The time for preparation has ended. In a howling darkness ahead, Morgan and his crew will learn whether their preparations are sufficient to survive what the sea is about to unleash upon them. Chapter 5. Riding the Hurricane. The wind screams like 10,000 demons as Royal Fortune climbs the face of a wave taller than any building you've ever seen. 40 feet of black water rises before the bow, and for a terrifying moment, the ship hangs suspended between sea and sky before plunging down the waves back into a trough deep enough to swallow cathedrals. This is riding the hurricane, a dance with death that requires perfect timing, iron nerves, and sails rigged in ways that would horrify any admiral. You are lashed to the wheel alongside two other helmsmen, because no single man can control a ship in winds that exceed 90 miles per hour. The wheel fights your grip like a living thing, trying to tear itself from your hands as rudder and sea battle for control of the ship's destiny. Your arms ache, your back screams, but letting go means letting Royal Fortune turn broadside to the waves, a death sentence delivered in seconds. The storm jib, a tiny triangle of heavy canvas no larger than a tavern table, is the only sail still set. Everything else has been furled and lashed to prevent the wind from ripping the masts from their roots. This postage stamp of cloth provides just enough drive to keep the ship's bow pointed into the waves while preventing the vessel from being driven backward faster than she can respond to the helm. Pirates learned that in hurricane winds, less sail means more control, and control means survival. Each wave arrives like a mountain of moving water, and timing becomes everything. Too early a turn, and the wave catches the ship's quarter, rolling her toward a capsize that no amount of ballast can prevent. Too late, and the bow doesn't rise fast enough to clear the wave's crest, allowing tons of green water to cascade onto the deck and potentially drive the vessel under. The helmsman must read each approaching wave, judge its height and speed, and adjust course with precision that leaves no margin for error. The ship's motion becomes violent beyond anything experienced in normal sailing. One moment you're pressed against the deck by forces that make your bones ache. The next you're weightless as the ship drops into a trough, your stomach floating inside your ribcage. Men who haven't lashed themselves to something solid become projectiles, thrown against bulkheads with enough force to break bones or crack skulls. The simple act of standing upright requires constant muscle tension and perfect balance. Lightning illuminates the chaos in stroboscopic flashes that reveal mountainous seas stretching to every horizon. The thunder that follows isn't the gentle rumble of land-based storms, but artillery barges that shake the ship's timbers and make conversation impossible. Between lightning strikes, the world disappears into darkness, so complete that the helmsman must steer by feel, reading the ship's motion through their bodies rather than their eyes. The wind changes direction constantly as the hurricane's circulation pattern moves over the ship. What begins as wind from the east becomes wind from the northeast, then north, following the storm's spiral arms as the eye approaches. Experienced captains use these direction changes to estimate their position within the storm and determine how much more punishment they must endure before reaching calmer conditions. Pirates who survived multiple hurricanes could read these wind shifts like a clock, counting down the hours until the storm's passage. Spray driven by hurricane winds arrives with the force of musket balls, stripping paint from metal and tearing exposed skin until faces bleed from dozens of tiny cuts. Breathing becomes dangerous when wind-driven water clogs nose and mouth, forcing crew members to turn their backs to the wind and gasp for air in the brief shelter of their own bodies. Some men fashion crude masks from cloth and tar to filter the spray, but these become waterlogged and useless within minutes. The rigging sings with notes that would be beautiful if they weren't harbingers of destruction. Hemp and iron respond to wind pressure by creating harmonic frequencies that resonate through the ship's structure. Experienced sailors learn to interpret these sounds. A rising note means increasing wind pressure. A discord warns of rigging failure. And silence means something has already broken. The ship becomes a massive musical instrument played by the storm, and those who understand her song can anticipate problems before they become catastrophic. The pumps work continuously as green water finds every weakness in the ship's construction, but the men operating them must time their efforts to the ship's motion. When Royal Fortune climbs a wave, the water in her bilges rushes aft. When she plunges into a trough, it rushes forward. Pumping efficiently requires working with this rhythm rather than fighting it. Pirates developed specialized techniques for maintaining pump operations in extreme conditions, including backup crews that could replace exhausted men without interrupting the vital flow of water removal. Steering requires understanding the relationship between wind, wave, and ship design that most sailors never learn because they never face conditions this extreme. The rudder's effectiveness changes dramatically as the ship's speed varies from nearly stationary in wave troughs to surfing speeds down wave faces. Pirates learn to anticipate these changes, adjusting helm position not for current conditions, but for what conditions would be when the rudder's influence finally reached the ship's bow. The psychological impact of riding out a hurricane tests even the steadiest nerves. The constant noise, violent motion, and awareness that death waits for any mistake creates stress that accumulates over hours until even experienced sailors begin making errors. Pirates developed rotation systems that moved men through different duties to prevent any individual from becoming overwhelmed by responsibility during the storm's worst moments. As the hours pass, though time becomes meaningless in the storm's darkness, the crew settles into the exhausting routine of survival. Some men collapse from exhaustion and must be dragged below deck. Others seem to find supernatural strength in desperation, working far beyond normal human endurance. The storm becomes a test, not just of seamanship, but of willpower, separating those who break under pressure from those who bend without breaking. Communication requires shouting directly into ears or using hand signals visible in lightning flashes. Orders must be simple and clear because complex instructions get lost in the wind's roar. Pirates developed their own storm-specific signals, gestures that could convey essential information even when speech becomes impossible. The hurricanes eye wall approaches with winds that will test everything the crew believes about the limits of survival at sea. Each wave brings them closer to the storm's center, where the real test of their preparations awaits. Chapter 6. Water, water everywhere. The sea has invaded Royal Fortune through every crack, seam, and opening that seemed watertight in calm weather. Water sloshes knee-deep across the gun deck, and the ship's pumps, designed to handle normal leakage, struggle against the deluge that hurricane winds drive through the vessel's defenses. You are part of the pump crew, and your survival depends on winning a race against the ocean itself. The chain pump closest to the mainmast clanks and groans as you heave on its handle with mechanical precision. Each stroke lifts a leather bucket from the bilges, carries it topside, and dumps it overboard, only to have the wind immediately blow that same water back across the deck. It feels futile, like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup, but stopping means drowning in a ship that becomes her own tomb. Pirates understood that pump work during storms wasn't about removing all the water. It was about removing enough to keep the ship from foundering. Water enters the ship through paths that fair weather never revealed. Gun ports sealed with tarred canvas weep steady streams, where wind pressure exceeds the strength of even doubled fabric. Deck seams that appeared tight now gape as the ship's timbers work against each other in the enormous seas. The hawse holes where anchor cables normally pass have become fountains shooting spray across the forecastle with each wave that crashes over the bow. Even the companionway hatches, battened down with storm covers, leak steadily as wind pressure forces water through gaps measured in fractions of inches. The bilge water isn't just seawater. It's a toxic soup of leaked tar, rotting food, human waste, and the ship's own dissolving interior. Working in this poisonous mixture without adequate protection causes skin to burn and wounds to fester. Men who slip and fall face first into bilge water often emerge blinded by the caustic brew, requiring immediate treatment with precious fresh water that the ship can ill afford to waste. Pirates learn to work pump duty in short shifts specifically to limit exposure to this contaminated environment. Below deck, the pumping operation becomes a choreographed nightmare. Teams of 4 men work each pump handle in rotating shifts, with fresh crews replacing exhausted ones every 15 minutes before muscle failure makes the work impossible. The rhythm must be maintained regardless of the ship's violent motion. Missing strokes when the vessel lurches can snap pump handles or crush fingers between moving parts. The pump crews develop their own cadence, calling out timing cues that can be heard even above the storm's roar. The ship's carpenter moves through the lower decks like a battlefield surgeon, plugging leaks with oakum, tar, and wooden plugs driven into gaps that threaten to enlarge into catastrophic breaches. His most critical work happens below the waterline, where even small leaks can quickly become mortal wounds. Working by the light of oil lamps that threaten to ignite spilled tar, he races against time and physics to keep the sea outside where it belongs. Pirates valued experienced carpenters above almost any other crew member because their skills often determined whether a ship survived storm damage. Emergency water removal requires every container aboard the ship. Cooking pots, buckets, helmets, even boots, anything that can hold water becomes part of an improvised bucket brigade. The crew forms human chains passing filled containers hand to hand from the bilges to the deck, where their contents join the thousands of gallons already covering every surface. This backup system becomes critical when mechanical pumps fail or become clogged with debris churning in the bilge water. The ship's motion makes the work exponentially harder. When Royal Fortune climbs a wave, all the water in her bilges rushes aft, concentrating in the stern and making the pumps there extremely effective while rendering forward pumps useless. When she plunges into a trough, the water rushes forward, reversing the situation. Pump crews must learn to work with this liquid tide rather than fighting it, timing their efforts to maximize efficiency when water concentrates near their station. Fresh water becomes precious beyond gold as the storm continues. The ship's drinking water supply, stored in wooden casks, becomes contaminated with salt spray that penetrates every storage area. Men working the pumps develop desperate thirst from their exertions, but drinking seawater means madness and death. The few remaining drops of fresh water must be rationed with religious care, often reserved for men whose duties are most critical to the ship's survival. Some crew members, overwhelmed by the futility of their efforts, begin drinking seawater despite knowing the consequences. Salt poisoning brings hallucinations, violent madness, and death within hours. These men must be restrained to prevent them from interfering with the pumping operation or throwing themselves overboard in their delirium. Pirates develop techniques for identifying early signs of salt poisoning, removing affected men from critical duties before their conditions worsened. The pump machinery itself requires constant maintenance during the storm. Leather buckets tear and must be patched with spare canvas. Iron chains stretch and break under constant use, requiring jury-rig repairs that hold just long enough to matter. The pump handles were smooth from wet hands and must be wrapped with rope to provide adequate grip. Pirates carried spare parts for critical pump components specifically because mechanical failure during a storm meant certain death. Ventilation systems designed to provide fresh air below deck must be sealed during hurricanes, creating an atmosphere thick with humidity and human exhalation. Men working in these conditions quickly become exhausted, requiring more frequent crew rotations and careful monitoring for signs of heat stroke or oxygen deprivation. The balance between keeping water out and allowing air circulation becomes a deadly calculation that requires constant adjustment as storm conditions change. As the hurricane continues, the battle against water becomes a battle against despair. The ocean seems infinite while the ship's capacity for resistance appears finite. Only iron discipline and the knowledge that stopping means certain death keeps the pumps working and the bucket brigades moving. Pirates who survived hurricanes often credited their success to maintaining pump operations when other crews gave up in exhaustion or despair. The water level in the bilges becomes the ship's vital sign. Rising means death approaches. Stable means survival remains possible, and falling represents victory over the sea's attempt at murder. Every stroke of the pump handles becomes a stroke toward dawn, toward the storm's end, toward the possibility of seeing another sunrise on waters that aren't trying to kill everyone aboard. Chapter 7. When Men Go Mad. The storm has raged for 18 hours, and the first man breaks. Thomas Wickham, a steady hand who's sailed with Roberts for 3 years, begins screaming that he can see his dead mother walking on the water, beckoning him to join her in peaceful rest beneath the waves. It takes 4 men to prevent him from throwing himself overboard, and his mad laughter echoes through the ship like a preview of hell itself. You are the bosun, responsible for maintaining discipline when the storm strips away everything that normally keeps men sane. The darkness, the noise, the constant threat of death, and the crushing realization that human skill means nothing against nature's fury, all combined to shatter minds that seemed unbreakable in normal circumstances. Madness spreads like plague in the cramped, terrified confines of a ship fighting for survival. Sleep becomes impossible when the ship's motion throws men from their hammocks every few minutes. Exhaustion accumulates like poison in the blood, and after 24 hours without rest, even experienced sailors begin seeing things that aren't there. Phantom ships sailing through the storm, voices calling from the water, and worse, visions of safety that drive men to abandon their posts in pursuit of illusions. Pirates learned to recognize sleep deprivation symptoms early, rotating men through duties that required less concentration when they showed signs of hallucination. The storm's psychological assault proves as dangerous as its physical violence. The constant howling of wind creates frequencies that resonate in human skulls, producing headaches so severe that some men bash their heads against bulkheads seeking relief. The lightning's stroboscopic flashes disorient vision and create temporary blindness that leaves men stumbling through darkness, convinced they've gone permanently blind. These physiological effects compound the terror of facing an enemy that cannot be fought or reasoned with. Fear spreads through the crew like wildfire. When one man begins sobbing that the ship is doomed, others take up the cry until the entire crew teeters on the edge of panic. Mass hysteria can kill everyone aboard faster than any storm. Men who abandon their duties to cower in the hold leave critical systems unmanned, while those who panic and rush topside get swept overboard by waves that show no mercy to fear. Pirates developed specific protocols for containing panic, including designated men whose sole responsibility was maintaining morale during extreme conditions. The bosun's mate, a giant named Black Sam who's never shown fear in battle, develops an uncontrollable tremor that makes him useless for any task requiring steady hands. He sits in a corner below deck, shaking like a leaf while mumbling prayers to gods he never acknowledged in calm weather. His breakdown terrifies other crew members who saw him as indestructible. If Black Sam can break, anyone can. The psychological impact of watching strong men crumble often triggers breakdowns in others who lose faith in their own ability to endure. Some men develop fixations on specific doom scenarios, becoming convinced that the mast will fall, the ship will founder, or the pumps will fail. They obsessively check and recheck equipment that's functioning properly, their paranoia making them more liability than asset. Others withdraw completely, curling into fetal positions and refusing to acknowledge the storm's existence, as if ignoring danger will make it disappear. These catatonic states require intervention because unresponsive men become dead weight that others must care for when every person's contribution is vital. The ship's cook, driven to hysteria by the impossibility of preparing food in the chaotic galley, begins throwing pots and utensils overboard, claiming they're contaminated by sea demons. His breakdown eliminates any possibility of hot food, removing one of the few comforts that might help maintain morale during the ordeal. Without the psychological boost of warm meals, hunger becomes another weapon the storm wields against sanity. Pirates understood the importance of maintaining normal routines whenever possible, as familiar activities provided psychological anchors in chaotic conditions. Religious mania infects the crew as men search for someone to blame for their suffering. Some declare the storm is divine punishment for their piratical crimes and demand Robert surrender to the nearest naval authority. Others insist someone aboard is cursed or possessed, leading to accusations and violence that threaten to destroy crew cohesion when unity is essential for survival. These religious breakdowns often targeted the most vulnerable crew members, creating dangerous internal conflicts that required immediate suppression. The darkness plays tricks with perception that drive men to the edge of madness. In the brief illumination of lightning flashes, rigging appears to be giant spiders. Waves look like attacking sea monsters, and fellow crew members become demons or ghosts. Men begin refusing to work alone, terrified of what they might encounter in the ship's dark corners. This fear of isolation forces the bosun to reorganize work details, ensuring that no man faces the storm's psychological pressure without human companionship. Communication becomes nearly impossible as the storm's roar drowns out voices, forcing men to rely on hand signals and gestures that are often misinterpreted in the darkness. Misunderstood orders lead to dangerous mistakes, while the inability to coordinate effectively makes every task exponentially more difficult and deadly. Pirates developed simplified command structures during storms, reducing complex operations to basic gestures that could be understood even by men on the edge of breakdown. The phenomenon of storm-induced claustrophobia affects even sailors accustomed to confined spaces. The combination of darkness, noise, and violent motion creates feelings of being trapped in a coffin that drives some men to desperate attempts at escape. They claw at sealed hatches, try to break down doors, or attempt to climb rigging in hurricane winds. All behaviors that endanger not just themselves, but anyone who tries to restrain them. Survivors' guilt begins affecting men who witness shipmates lost to the storm. When a crew member is swept overboard or crushed by loose cargo, others begin questioning why they survived while good men died. This psychological burden can destroy a man's will to continue fighting for survival, leading to passive acceptance of death that becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Pirates learn to address these feelings immediately, emphasizing that honoring the dead meant surviving to tell their stories. The bosun maintains discipline through a combination of authority, fear, and psychological manipulation. He identifies the steadiest men and keeps them working in pairs with those showing signs of breakdown, using peer pressure and shame to prevent complete collapse. He also employs strategic violence. A swift punch or kick delivered at the right moment can shock a panicking man back to functionality. But this approach requires careful judgment, as excessive force can trigger mutinous behavior among men already pushed beyond their limits. Sleep deprivation creates its own psychological horrors as men begin experiencing waking nightmares indistinguishable from reality. Sailors report seeing dead shipmates working alongside the living or believing they're back in their childhood homes rather than aboard a ship fighting for survival. These hallucinations become so vivid that affected men attempt to interact with phantom people or objects, creating confusion and danger for everyone nearby. The storm's duration intensifies every psychological pressure as hours stretch into what feels like days without relief. Men who might have endured a brief, intense storm find their mental defenses eroding under prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. Pirates learned that psychological breakdown followed predictable patterns, with most men reaching crisis points after 24 to 48 hours of continuous storm conditions. Temperature fluctuations add another layer of psychological stress, as the storm circulation creates rapid changes between tropical heat and surprising cold. Men's bodies struggle to adapt to these variations while already dealing with exhaustion, fear, and physical stress. The inability to maintain comfortable body temperature becomes another factor contributing to mental breakdown. As the hours drag on, survival becomes as much about maintaining sanity as maintaining the ship. The ocean attacks not just wood and canvas, but human minds, and those who break mentally often take others with them into madness. The storm tests every assumption about courage, endurance, and human nature when stripped of civilization's comforting illusions. Chapter 8. Navigation in Hell. The compass spins like a child's top, its needle seeking magnetic north while the ship pitches and rolls through angles that would be impossible on land. You are the navigator, and your instruments, designed for calm seas and clear skies, have become nearly useless in conditions that seem to suspend the normal laws of physics. Finding your position in a hurricane isn't navigation. It's educated guessing, seasoned with desperation and prayer. The ship's compass, normally the navigator's most trusted tool, betrays you constantly as the vessel's violent motion makes accurate readings impossible. When Royal Fortune climbs a wave at a 30-degree angle, the compass tilts with her, throwing off readings by dangerous margins. Lightning strikes nearby create electromagnetic disturbances that send the needle dancing wildly, pointing toward phantom norths that exist only in the storm's electrical chaos. Pirates learn to take multiple compass readings and average them, But even this technique fails when the ship's motion becomes too violent for consistent measurements. Dead reckoning, calculating position based on course, speed, and time, becomes an exercise in futility when you can't determine any of those variables accurately. The ship's course changes constantly as helmsmen fight to keep her bow pointed into the waves. Speed varies from motionless in wave troughs to terrifying acceleration down wave faces. Time itself seems distorted in the storm's eternal night, where minutes feel like hours and hours pass like seconds. Pirates developed alternative timing methods using physical sensations and natural rhythms when mechanical timepieces failed in hurricane conditions. The log line, normally used to measure the ship's speed through water, becomes a dangerous liability when deployed in hurricane conditions. Wind and current create such chaotic water motion that speed measurements bear no relationship to actual progress over the seafloor. Worse, the log line itself becomes a hazard that can foul the rudder or be torn away by debris churning in the storm-driven seas. Some navigators attempted to use the ship's motion itself as a speed indicator, judging velocity by the force required to maintain position at the helm. Celestial navigation requires seeing the sun, moon, or stars, impossible when the hurricane's clouds create darkness so complete that noon resembles midnight. The sextant, precision instrument capable of measuring angles to within seconds of arc, becomes worthless when the horizon disappears in spray and the sky vanishes behind walls of cloud. Even if celestial bodies were visible, the ship's motion would make accurate measurements impossible. Pirates who survived multiple storms often abandoned traditional celestial techniques in favor of wind pattern navigation that worked in any weather. Chart work in the storm becomes a nightmare of wet paper, flying instruments, and calculations performed by lamplight that gutters and dies in wind-driven spray. Sea charts not properly secured become projectiles that can blind or injure crew members, while ink runs in the constant moisture, making position plots illegible just when accuracy matters most. The navigator must work with charts weighted down and protected by canvas covers, performing calculations while braced against the ship's violent motion. Soundings, measuring water depth to determine position relative to known bottom contours, become impossible when the lead line can't reach bottom through mountainous seas. Even in shallower water, the line's behavior in storm conditions provides no useful information about depth or bottom composition. The hurricane transforms familiar waters into alien seas, where traditional navigation aids cease to function. Pirates developed alternative depth-finding techniques based on wave behavior and watercolor, though these methods required extensive local knowledge. Landmark navigation fails completely when visibility drops to zero and coastal features disappear behind walls of wind-driven spray and rain. Lighthouses, church spires, and prominent hills, the fixed points that normally guide ships safely to harbor, vanish as if they never existed. The storm creates a world where the only landmarks are the waves themselves, each one different from its predecessor and successor. Experienced navigators learn to identify subtle differences in wave patterns that indicated proximity to land or shallow water. The navigator must rely on techniques passed down through generations of sailors who survived similar conditions. Wind direction patterns within hurricanes follow predictable rules. If you can determine which part of the storm you're in, you can estimate the direction to the eye and plan accordingly. But reading wind direction requires experience that comes only from surviving previous storms, knowledge purchased with blood and terror. Pirates who mastered storm navigation became valuable beyond measure, their skills often determining whether entire crews lived or died. Current patterns change dramatically during hurricanes as storms surge and wind-driven water create temporary rivers in the ocean. Familiar currents reverse direction or disappear entirely, while new currents appear where none existed before. The navigator must account for these changes while having no reliable way to measure their strength or direction. Some pirates learn to read current patterns by observing debris behavior or noting changes in water temperature and color. Time estimation becomes critical when all other navigation methods fail. An experienced navigator can estimate the storm's movement and the ship's position within it based on how long the wind has blown from each direction. This requires maintaining accurate time records when clocks are damaged by moisture and shock, and crew members are too exhausted to perform regular chronometer duties. Pirates developed backup timing methods using sand glasses, candle measurements, and even pulse counting during extreme conditions. The psychological pressure on the navigator intensifies as other crew members look to him for reassurance that the ship isn't lost forever in the storm's chaos. He must project confidence while privately acknowledging that his position estimates could be wrong by dozens of miles. A navigator who admits uncertainty can destroy crew morale, but one who claims false precision may guide the ship toward hidden dangers. This psychological burden often proved as challenging as the technical difficulties of storm navigation. Emergency navigation techniques developed by pirates include using the ship's motion to estimate wave direction and height, which can provide clues about proximity to land or shallow water. Experienced navigators learn to read the color and behavior of storm waves, distinguishing between deep water swells and the shorter, steeper waves that indicate dangerous shoals. The sound of breaking waves can sometimes be heard even above a hurricane's roar, providing audible warnings of nearby hazards. Weather pattern recognition becomes crucial when traditional navigation fails. Hurricane circulation follows mathematical laws that create predictable wind and pressure patterns. A navigator who understands these patterns can estimate the storm's center, track its movement, and predict when conditions will improve. This knowledge allows strategic decisions about whether to ride out the storm or attempt to escape its circulation. The temperature and humidity changes within hurricane systems provide additional navigation clues for those trained to read them. Different parts of the storm carry distinctive atmospheric signatures that experienced navigators can identify. The eye wall brings sudden temperature drops, while the eye itself creates an eerily calm microclimate that contrasts sharply with surrounding violence. Bird behavior, when visible, offers navigation hints that supplement instrument readings. Even in hurricane conditions, seabirds maintain some sense of direction and land proximity. Pirates learn to interpret bird flight patterns as indicators of wind shifts, land proximity, and storm intensity changes. These biological compasses sometimes provided the only reliable directional information available during extreme weather. In the hurricane's chaos, navigation becomes less science than art, requiring intuition honed by years of experience and luck that no amount of skill can guarantee. The navigator's greatest tool becomes not his instruments, but his understanding of the sea's behavior in extreme conditions. Knowledge that transforms educated guessing into survival strategy when conventional navigation fails completely. Chapter 9. The Devil's Calm. The wind dies as suddenly as a snuffed candle, and the silence that follows is more terrifying than any storm. Royal Fortune sits motionless in water smooth as black glass, surrounded by towering walls of cloud that spiral upward into infinity. You have entered the eye of the hurricane, a 20-mile circle of deceptive peace where the air barely stirs and stars shine through the opening above like diamonds viewed through a telescope. But this isn't salvation. This is the storm's heart, and all around you, nature's most violent forces continue their deadly dance. You're the ship's lookout, and your duty is to watch for the eye wall's return while the crew makes desperate repairs during this temporary reprieve. The calm is absolute, unnatural, and deeply unsettling after hours of chaos that seemed endless. Water drips from the rigging like tears, and every sound, footsteps on deck, voices calling orders, the creak of damaged timbers, echoes strangely in the hurricane's hollow center. The eye creates its own microclimate, a pocket of stillness surrounded by violence that defies every law of weather you thought you understood. The crew emerges from below deck like survivors crawling from a collapsed mine. Men who spent hours lashed to their posts to avoid being swept overboard now move freely across a deck that barely rocks. The contrast is so extreme that some sailors stumble, their bodies still compensating for motion that no longer exists. Others stand motionless, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile peace and return them to the nightmare they've just escaped. Above your head, the eye's walls rise like the inside of a vast cathedral built from cloud and wind. Lightning flickers continuously within these vertical ramparts, illuminating their structure in stroboscopic flashes that reveal layers of circulation moving at impossible speeds. The eye wall towers 40,000 feet into the sky, a cylinder of organized violence that dwarfs any human construction. Standing inside this natural coliseum, you understand why ancient sailors believed hurricanes were divine punishment unleashed by angry gods. The sea itself tells the story of what surrounds you. Waves from different directions crisscross the eye in confused patterns, creating interference patterns that make the water's surface ripple like hammered metal. These are the same waves that nearly destroyed your ship, but now they arrive from all compass points simultaneously, their violence canceled by mathematical precision. The eye's calm exists because competing forces balance each other perfectly, a temporary equilibrium that will collapse the moment the storm's geometry shifts. Captain Roberts uses this precious time to assess damage that couldn't be examined during the storm's fury. The mainmast shows stress fractures that could lead to catastrophic failure when the eye wall returns. 3 gun ports have been stove in by green water, and the pumps have been working at maximum capacity just to keep the ship afloat. Most critically, the rudder shows signs of damage that could leave them helpless when steering becomes vital again. Every minute of calm must be used for repairs that will determine whether they survive the hurricane's second half. The ship's carpenter works with desperate efficiency, knowing that his repairs must hold not just in calm conditions, but when the storm returns with renewed fury. Damaged timbers receive emergency bracing that wouldn't be acceptable in normal circumstances, but might last long enough to matter. Torn canvas gets patched with spare sailcloth, and rigging receives additional stays that transform the ship's appearance, but might preserve her structural integrity when the wind begins screaming again. Fresh water becomes available for the first time in hours as rain collected during the storm's passage can finally be accessed from barrels and tarps. Men who've been working in brutal heat drink carefully measured rations, while others use precious water to treat injuries that couldn't be addressed during the chaos. Burns from rope friction, cuts from flying debris, and salt sores from constant spray all receive attention during this brief window when medical care becomes possible. The eye's stillness reveals damage to crew morale that the storm's noise had masked. Men who maintained discipline during the hurricane's worst moments now show signs of psychological exhaustion that threaten to undermine their ability to endure what's coming. Some sailors sit motionless, staring at nothing, while others talk constantly in nervous chatter that reveals how close they came to complete breakdown. The bosun identifies men who need encouragement, those who require firm direction, and others who must be watched carefully to prevent panic when the storm returns. Navigation becomes possible again as the compass settles and the horizon reappears. The navigator takes bearings on the eye wall's movement to estimate the hurricane's track and their position within it. This information determines how long the calm will last and from which direction the wind will return. Pirates who survived multiple hurricanes learned to read the eye's characteristics like a clock, counting down the minutes until the second half of their ordeal begins. The temperature inside the eye often differs dramatically from the surrounding storm, creating a microclimate that can be surprisingly comfortable despite the violence just miles away. Humidity drops as dry air descends from the upper atmosphere, and the oppressive heat that builds during the storm's approach dissipates. Some crew members remove waterlogged clothing to dry in the eye's strange peace, though they know this comfort is temporary. Wildlife behavior in the eye provides entertainment and ominous warnings simultaneously. Seabirds trapped within the hurricane's circulation appear suddenly, exhausted and disoriented by their involuntary flight through the storm. Some land on the ship's rigging, too tired to continue flying, while others circle aimlessly in the calm air. These birds are living barometers. When they take flight again, it means they sense the approaching return of violent winds. The psychological impact of the eye's calm can be as dangerous as its violence. Men who endured hours of terror suddenly find themselves in conditions so peaceful they seem like salvation. This false security can lead to complacency, with crew members believing their ordeal is over when they're actually only halfway through. Pirates learn to use the eye's calm for necessary work, while maintaining awareness that worse conditions might lie ahead. Debris from other ships appears in the eye's calm waters, grim reminders of vessels that didn't survive the storm's first half. Pieces of masts, shattered planking, and sometimes bodies float past like warnings from the future. These remnants serve as sobering reminders that the hurricane has already claimed victims and will continue hunting until it exhausts itself over land or cold water. The eye's movement determines how long this reprieve will last. A fast-moving hurricane might provide only 30 minutes of calm, while a slow-moving storm could offer several hours. The navigator must calculate not just how much time remains, but which side of the eye they're on, because this determines whether the worst winds are still ahead or behind them. Pirates who misjudged the eye's movement often found themselves overwhelmed by winds stronger than anything they'd previously experienced. Sound behavior changes dramatically in the eye's still air. Voices carry farther than normal, creating an illusion of intimacy that contrasts sharply with the communication difficulties of the storm. Orders can be given in normal tones, and crew members can hear damage assessments that might reveal problems requiring immediate attention. This clarity of communication makes the eye valuable for coordinating repairs and planning for the storm's return. As the eye wall approaches again, the signs are unmistakable. The circular opening above begins to close as clouds spiral inward. The wind picks up gradually, then suddenly. Birds take flight in panic, and the sea's surface begins showing the first ripples of returning violence. The eye's peace dissolves like a morning dream, and the hurricane's second act begins with winds that often exceed the fury of its opening performance. Chapter 10. Jury-Rigged Salvation. The mainmast groans like a dying giant as another crack appears in its base, spreading upward through oak timbers thick as a man's waist. The storm has returned with doubled fury after the eye's deceptive calm, and now Royal Fortune fights for survival with rigging that hangs in tatters and spars that threaten to collapse at any moment. You are the ship's carpenter, and your jury-rig repairs must hold together long enough to see another dawn, using nothing but scraps, rope, and a desperate ingenuity that keeps pirates alive when everything else fails. The foremast has snapped 20 feet above the deck, leaving a jagged stump that threatens to punch through the hull with each wave impact. Working in darkness broken only by lightning flashes, you and 3 other men struggle to secure a jury mast fashioned from the ship's spare yards lashed together with every piece of rope still serviceable. The replacement won't be pretty, but it might provide enough sail area to maintain steerage way when the storm finally begins to weaken. Every repair requires improvisation that would horrify shipyard workers, but might save lives when conventional solutions are impossible. The ship's hull has been damaged by a green sea that swept the quarterdeck, leaving the helmsman fighting a loose-spoked wheel that turns without engaging the rudder. Your solution involves wedging wooden blocks between the spokes and wrapping the entire assembly in rope to create enough friction for basic steering control. It's crude, but crude repairs that work are infinitely superior to elegant solutions that fail. The pumps receive constant attention as their machinery breaks down under continuous use. Leather bucket valves tear and must be replaced with canvas patches sealed with tar and hope. Iron chain links stretch and break, requiring splicing techniques that reduce efficiency but maintain function. Most critically, the pump handles themselves crack under the enormous stresses of operating in hurricane conditions. Your backup handles, carved from spare spars during the ice calm, may not last a night, but they might last long enough. Sailcloth becomes more precious than gold as the hurricane destroys canvas faster than it can be replaced. The storm jib that kept them alive during the worst winds has been shredded beyond repair, requiring a replacement sewn from every available scrap of fabric aboard. Old shirts, spare blankets, and even torn hammocks get incorporated into a patchwork sail that looks ridiculous, but might catch enough wind to prevent the ship from wallowing helplessly in the troughs between waves. Below deck, structural repairs focus on preventing catastrophic failures that could sink the ship within minutes. Cracked frames receive reinforcement from spare timbers wedged into place and held by rope lashings that distribute stress across multiple structural members. These repairs won't win any prizes for craftsmanship, but they transform potential break points into flexible joints that can bend without breaking when the ship's hull flexes in extreme seas. The rigging requires complete reorganization as wire stays snap and rope shrouds part under loads that exceed their breaking strength. Your replacement rigging uses shorter lengths of rope joined by knots that reduce overall strength, but can be accomplished quickly in hurricane conditions. The forest of lines supporting the mast becomes a spider web of improvised connections that somehow maintains structural integrity despite appearing chaotic to any observer who understands traditional seamanship. Water intrusion through storm damage requires creative solutions when conventional materials aren't available. Canvas patches nailed over breached planking slow leaks, but can't stop them entirely. Your most effective repairs involve using sailmaker's needles to sew patches directly to the hull, creating flexible seals that move with the ship rather than fighting her motion. Lead sheets hammered into gaps provide temporary waterproofing that might last hours rather than days, but hours might be enough. The galley's destruction eliminates any possibility of hot food, but hunger becomes secondary to the more immediate problem of keeping the ship's oil lamps burning for essential work. Cooking oil, lamp oil, and even rum get diverted to maintaining light sources that allow critical repairs to continue in the hurricane's darkness. These improvised torches burn irregularly and produce choking smoke, but they provide just enough illumination for emergency work that can't wait for daylight. Personal equipment receives attention when time permits, because individual survival tools often determine who lives through disasters that destroy conventional support systems. Knives get resharpened on broken grinding stones. Waterlogged clothing gets wrung out and repositioned for maximum warmth, and essential rope work tools receive emergency repairs that restore basic functionality. Pirates learned that personal preparedness often mattered more than ship's equipment when everything began failing simultaneously. Communication systems require constant improvisation as speaking trumpets get lost overboard and voice signals become impossible in the wind's roar. Your solution involves rigging a series of ropes that can be jerked to send simple signals throughout the ship. 1 pull for all hands, 2 for emergency, 3 for abandoned stations. These primitive communication lines allow coordination between different parts of the vessel when more sophisticated methods fail completely. The ship's boats present impossible choices between preserving escape options and preventing additional damage. Keeping them on deck risks having them torn loose and used as battering rams by hurricane winds. Storing them below eliminates deck hazards, but removes the crew's only chance of survival if the ship founders. Your compromise involves partially disassembling the boats so they can be stored compactly while remaining capable of quick reassembly if needed for emergency evacuation. Spare materials get allocated according to mathematical calculations that balance current needs against future requirements. Every piece of rope, canvas, or iron must be used efficiently because waste means death when supplies are finite and the storm shows no signs of weakening. Pirates developed triage systems for equipment that paralleled medical triage. Some damage gets repaired immediately. Other problems get temporary patches, and certain failures must be accepted as irreparable under current conditions. Tool maintenance becomes critical when basic implements break under extreme use. Hammers lose their heads and must be re-wedged with wooden shims. Saws develop broken teeth that require filing to maintain cutting ability. Most importantly, the carpenter's adze, essential for shaping emergency repairs, develops a loose handle that must be secured with cord wrapping that preserve its functionality while reducing its effectiveness. The psychological aspect of emergency repairs affects both the workers and the observers who depend on their success. Men performing jury-rigged fixes must project confidence even when they privately doubt their solutions will hold. Meanwhile, crew members watching these repairs need reassurance that someone understands the problems and is working to solve them. Pirates learned that the appearance of competent repair work often mattered as much as its actual effectiveness in maintaining crew morale. Weather timing becomes crucial when planning repairs that can only be accomplished during brief lulls in the storm's intensity. Complex fixes requiring multiple steps must be broken down into segments that can be completed between wave impacts or wind gusts. The carpenter develops an intuitive sense of the storm's rhythm, identifying brief windows when critical work can be accomplished before conditions become impossible again. Material substitution requires understanding the essential functions of damaged components rather than their traditional construction. A broken mast doesn't need to be replaced with another mast. It needs to be replaced with something that can support sail and distribute loads to the hull. A damaged pump doesn't need perfect restoration. It needs enough functionality to move water from the bilge to the deck. This pragmatic approach allows solutions that work despite being completely unlike their original counterparts. As dawn approaches, the hurricane shows its first signs of weakening, and the jury-rigged ship continues floating when dozens of properly maintained vessels have already foundered. The repairs won't last long in normal conditions, but they don't need to last long. They only need to last until the storm passes and proper repairs can be made in calm water. Sometimes survival depends not on excellence, but on adequacy, and adequate solutions implemented quickly often prove superior to perfect solutions that arrive too late. Chapter 11. When the ship dies. The crack of breaking timber echoes across the water like cannon fire as HMS Revenge, caught beam on to a 40-foot wave, breaks her back with a sound that every sailor knows means death. The proud frigate that terrorized Spanish shipping for 3 years folds in the middle like a closing book, her two halves connected only by rigging that parts with snaps like breaking guitar strings. You watch from Royal Fortune's deck as 200 pirates face the choice between drowning quickly in a sinking ship or drowning slowly in hurricane seas. The death of a ship in extreme weather follows predictable patterns that experienced sailors recognize like symptoms of a terminal disease. First comes the loss of steerage as rudder damage or steering failure leaves the vessel at the mercy of wind and wave. Then structural failure begins, frames crack, planking opens, and the hull starts working apart as forces exceed what oak and iron can endure. Finally comes the moment when the sea wins and the ship surrenders, taking down with her anyone who can't escape her embrace. Revenge's crew has perhaps 10 minutes before their ship disappears beneath the waves, and every second counts in ways that landlubbers can never understand. The first priority is launching boats if any survive the storm's destruction, but hurricane winds make this nearly impossible. Lifeboats designed for calm water become death traps when waves large enough to swallow buildings crash over crews attempting to lower them. Most boats launched in hurricane conditions flip immediately or get stove in against the ship's hull before clearing her side. You are Revenge's bosun, and your duty is to organize abandonment procedures when organization seems impossible. The ship lists heavily to starboard as water pours through her broken hull, making movement across the deck treacherous for men who must reach survival equipment before the angle becomes too steep for anyone to remain upright. Crew members slide toward the low side where they risk being trapped below deck when the ship makes her final plunge. Life preservers in the 18th century consist of cork-filled canvas vests that provide minimal buoyancy in calm water and become death sentences in hurricane seas. The cork absorbs water and adds weight rather than providing flotation, while the canvas tears apart in the violence of storm waves. Pirates learned to improvise flotation devices from empty water barrels, spare yards lashed together, or anything that might trap air long enough to keep a man's head above water for a few extra minutes. The ship's breakup creates deadly projectiles as masts, spars, and rigging fall in random directions driven by wind and the vessel's death throes. A falling mainmast can crush a dozen men instantly, while broken yards with iron fittings become spears hurled by hurricane winds. The safest position during a ship's destruction is often underwater, where debris passes overhead rather than through human bodies, but holding breath while fighting for surface becomes impossible in chaotic seas. Swimming in hurricane conditions requires techniques that differ completely from normal water survival. Waves too large to swim over must be dived under, requiring swimmers to gauge their timing perfectly while exhausted and terrified. Wind-driven spray makes breathing difficult even when above surface, and the salt water's temperature can induce hypothermia within hours despite tropical latitude. Most critically, the waves' confused patterns make it impossible to swim in any consistent direction towards safety. Flotation debris from the broken ship offers temporary salvation that often becomes floating death traps. Pieces of mast or deck planking can support human weight briefly, but hurricane waves tear survivors loose with forces that dislocate joints and break bones. Rope rigging creates tangles that can trap swimmers underwater, while jagged wood edges opened by the ship's violent destruction cut flesh with every wave impact. The debris field that surrounds a sinking vessel becomes a minefield of hazards that shift constantly in the storm's chaos. Royal Fortune attempts rescue operations that border on suicide, maneuvering close enough to throw lines to Revenge's survivors while avoiding collision with debris that could damage her own hull. The rescue ship's crew lashes themselves to the rigging and throws every available rope toward men struggling in the water, but hurricane winds blow most lines away before they reach their targets. Successfully retrieving even one swimmer requires perfect timing, enormous luck, and strength that exceeds normal human capacity. Group survival techniques developed by pirates recognize that individual effort rarely succeeds in extreme conditions. Survivors who manage to reach the same piece of floating debris work together to maintain their grip, taking turns resting while others hold on during the worst wave impacts. These human chains increase everyone's survival chances, but they also mean that if one person loses strength and lets go, others may be pulled down with them. The water temperature paradox of hurricane conditions creates survival challenges that seem contradictory. Tropical water warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia also promotes rapid dehydration as survivors' bodies overheat from exertion. Salt water intake becomes inevitable when breathing spray-filled air, leading to kidney failure and hallucinations that make rational decision-making impossible. The same warm water that keeps men alive long enough to be rescued also slowly poisons them if rescue doesn't arrive quickly. Psychological factors determine survival as much as physical ones when ships die in storms. Panic kills swimmers faster than drowning, as fear-induced hyperventilation leads to muscle cramps and poor decision-making. Survivors who accept their situation calmly and focus on immediate priorities, staying afloat, staying together, staying conscious, often outlive stronger swimmers who exhaust themselves fighting conditions they cannot control. The sea's violence during hurricanes transforms floating debris into constantly shifting hazards that require split-second decisions for survival. A piece of decking that provides life-saving flotation one moment becomes a battering ram the next when wave action drives it toward survivors' heads. Ropes that offer handholds for reaching safety can also become nooses that drag swimmers underwater when they tangle around arms or legs in the chaos. Time becomes the ultimate enemy as physical exhaustion accumulates faster than rescue can arrive. Even strong swimmers rarely survive more than a few hours in hurricane conditions, and most succumb within minutes when exhaustion combines with injuries sustained during the ship's destruction. The mathematics of survival in extreme seas favor quick rescue or quick death over prolonged struggles that only delay the inevitable. Night abandonment adds layers of horror to already desperate situations, as darkness makes it impossible to see approaching waves, floating debris, or potential rescue ships. Survivors must judge wave timing by sound and feel rather than sight, while rescuers can't spot swimmers beyond the reach of their lights. Hurricane conditions that are merely deadly in daylight become absolutely lethal when darkness removes the last sensory advantages humans possess over the sea's mindless violence. The final irony of ship destruction in hurricanes is that survival often depends on being lucky enough to be thrown clear of the wreckage rather than trapped within it. The violence that destroys the vessel also launches crew members far enough from the debris field to avoid being crushed by falling rigging or sucked down by the ship's final plunge. In the cruel mathematics of maritime disaster, those who seem most doomed by being hurled into the sea sometimes prove to be the only survivors. As HMS Revenge makes her final dive toward the ocean floor, taking down with her the dreams and nightmares of 200 pirates, the survivors face hours or days of struggle against odds that would make gambling with loaded dice seem reasonable by comparison. Chapter 12. Castaways and Cannibals. The island appears through dawn mist like a fever dream made real, a crescent of white sand backed by palm trees that seem impossible after days of fighting hurricane seas on a makeshift raft built from Royal Fortune's shattered remains. You and 7 other survivors have somehow reached this speck of land that doesn't appear on any chart, a place so remote that rescue may never come. Your relief at finding solid ground fades quickly when you realize that survival on a tropical paradise requires skills that piracy never taught. The raft that carried you here won't survive another day in the surf that pounds this nameless atoll. Built from spare masts lashed together with ropes salvaged from the ship's death throes, it served its purpose of keeping 8 men alive for 3 days and nights of horror. Now it disintegrates on the coral reef that nearly killed you before offering salvation. Its remains scattered by waves that would have drowned you all if not for the island's protection. Fresh water becomes your first priority because the human body's tolerance for dehydration in tropical heat measures survival time in hours rather than days. The island shows no obvious streams or springs, forcing you to search for water sources that may not exist. Rainwater collected in palm fronds provides temporary relief, but storing it requires containers that must be fashioned from coconut shells or improvised from salvage materials. Every drop becomes precious when your alternative is drinking seawater that promises madness and death. Food sources on an uninhabited tropical island seem abundant to landlubbers, but prove challenging for sailors whose maritime skills don't translate to foraging and hunting. Coconuts provide nutrition and liquid, but opening them requires tools that must be improvised from rocks and salvaged metal. Fish swim in the coral lagoon, but catching them demands techniques that ship's cooks never learned. Seabirds offer protein, but they nest in locations accessible only to men willing to risk their lives climbing cliff faces without ropes or safety equipment. Shelter construction requires understanding tropical weather patterns that differ dramatically from the storms you survived at sea. The same sun that feels pleasant during cool ocean breezes becomes deadly when there's no wind and no shade. Sudden tropical downpours arrive without warning, turning sandy beaches into muddy swamps and making fire maintenance nearly impossible. Your shelter must protect against sun, rain, wind, and insects while being constructed entirely from materials found on an island that may lack basic necessities. Fire becomes essential for survival, but proves nearly impossible to maintain in an environment where everything is either damp from ocean spray or soaked by tropical rains. Salvaged flint and steel from the ship's wreckage provides ignition sources, but finding dry tinder requires constant effort. Once started, fires must be protected from wind and rain while being fed with materials that burn properly. Not all tropical woods make good fuel, and some produce toxic smoke that can blind or poison anyone who breathes it. The psychological challenges of island survival often prove more deadly than physical hardships. Men accustomed to the social structure of a ship find themselves without clear leadership or defined roles when basic survival requires skills none of them possess. Arguments develop over resource allocation, work assignments, and leadership decisions that will be settled quickly by established ship's discipline, but become festering sources of conflict when there's no external authority to enforce order. Captain Roberts, the most experienced leader among the survivors, finds his authority challenged by men who believe democratic decision-making is more appropriate for their desperate circumstances. But democracy requires time and discussion that survival situations rarely permit, and disagreements over basic survival priorities can lead to fatal delays when immediate action is essential. The social dynamics that worked aboard a pirate ship prove inadequate for organizing survival on an island where different skills matter more than maritime experience. Tool making becomes essential when survival requires implements that ships don't normally carry. Knives must be fashioned from salvaged metal and sharpened on coral or volcanic rock. Fishing hooks get carved from bones or bent from nails pulled from driftwood. Containers for water and food storage require hours of patient work with inadequate tools. And every implement must be maintained carefully because replacement materials may not be available when tools break or wear out. The island's isolation reveals itself gradually as ships fail to appear on the horizon and no signs of human habitation emerge during exploration. The castaways begin to understand that rescue depends entirely on chance. A passing vessel whose lookouts spot their signal fires, or a storm that drives merchant ships close enough to this remote atoll to notice signs of habitation. Without regular shipping routes nearby, they face the possibility of spending years on the island or dying there without ever seeing another human face. Rationing becomes critical when the island's resources prove more limited than initially apparent. Coconuts don't regenerate quickly enough to support 8 men indefinitely, and fishing success varies dramatically based on weather, tides, and the fisherman's gradually improving skills. Food storage becomes impossible in the tropical heat and humidity, forcing a hand-to-mouth existence where daily foraging determines whether everyone eats or someone goes hungry. Medical care requires improvisation when injuries and illnesses occur far from any physician or medical supplies. Coral cuts become infected in the tropical environment, requiring treatment with seawater, honey from wild bees, or plant medicines that may or may not be effective. Broken bones must be set using splints made from driftwood and bandages torn from clothing. Most seriously, diseases like malaria or dysentery can kill isolated castaways who might survive the same illnesses with proper medical attention. The temptation of cannibalism emerges gradually as hunger becomes chronic and some group members weaken from malnutrition, injury, or disease. Pirates who showed no mercy to enemies find themselves contemplating horrors that would have disgusted them aboard ship when food was available and death came quickly in battle. The moral boundaries that civilization maintains through law and custom begin eroding when survival requires choices that no man should face, but desperate men must consider. Weather patterns on the island follow seasonal cycles that can either doom or save the castaways depending on their timing. Hurricane season brings storms that could destroy their shelters and wash away freshwater supplies, but the same storms might drive ships close enough for rescue. Dry seasons preserve their carefully maintained fires, but reduce fresh water sources to critical levels. Understanding these patterns becomes essential for long-term survival planning, when short-term thinking leads to fatal mistakes. Signal systems must be maintained constantly because rescue opportunities may appear and disappear within hours. Signal fires require stockpiled fuel that stays dry despite tropical rains, and smoke signals must be produced quickly when ships appear on the horizon. Mirrors made from salvaged glass or polished metal can flash signals across vast distances, but only when positioned correctly and operated by someone who understands maritime communication protocols. The island's coral reef system that provided protection during their arrival becomes a navigation hazard that may prevent rescue ships from approaching close enough to attempt pickup. Vessels that spot their signals may be unable to reach them safely, and the castaways must be prepared to reach ships anchored beyond the reef using improvised boats or swimming techniques that risk their lives in shark-infested waters. As weeks turn to months and hope of quick rescue fades, the survivors face the horrible realization that their tropical paradise may become their permanent home or their final grave. The skills that made them successful pirates prove inadequate for the different challenges of island survival, and their brotherhood begins fracturing under pressures that the sea never imposed. The sound of waves on coral becomes a constant reminder that the ocean brought them here and may be their only route to escape. If they can build vessels capable of reaching shipping lanes hundreds of miles away through waters that have already claimed one ship and may claim another. Chapter 13. The Graveyard of Ships. The bones of 100 vessels rest beneath these waters, their masts reaching upward through the darkness like the fingers of drowned giants. You stand on the deck of a salvage vessel, 30 years after the great hurricane of 1703, and the charts in your hands tell stories written in depths and dates. Each mark representing a ship that didn't survive nature's fury, each notation a crew that learned too late that the sea collects its debts in full. The windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola has become known among sailors as the Hurricane Graveyard, where the seafloor tells the complete history of Caribbean piracy through wrecks scattered across its depths. Spanish treasure galleons lie beside English frigates, their eternal rest unmarked by the flags that once divided them. French buccaneers rest near Dutch merchants, all equal now in the democracy of death that storms impose without regard for allegiance. HMS Winchester went down in September 1695, taking 400 souls to the bottom when hurricane winds drove her onto the reefs near Port Royal. The ship's final moments came when her anchor cables parted and she drove backward into shallow water, breaking apart as her stern struck coral that cut through oak planking like a knife through flesh. The Spanish Plate Fleet of 1715 met its end not in battle, but in a hurricane that scattered 11 treasure ships along Florida's coast like toys thrown by an angry child. More wealth sank in that single storm than pirates captured in a decade of raiding. Silver from Potosi, gold from New Granada, and gems that now feed crabs scuttling through flooded cargo holds. Black Sam Bellamy's Widow met her fate in April 1717 when a nor'easter caught the ship off Cape Cod, driving her into shoal waters where no amount of seamanship could save her. The pirate prince who called himself the Robin Hood of the seas discovered that nature recognizes no nobility in theft, no honor in rebellion against authority. The charts reveal patterns that experienced sailors learn to read, like prophecies written in salt and blood. Ships tend to founder in the same waters where ocean currents create confused seas, where sudden shoals rise from deep water, and where hurricane tracks converge like highways leading to hell. The Mona Passage, the Windward Passage, and the treacherous waters off Cape Hatteras appear again and again in the records of vessels that sailed out but never sailed home. Storm patterns that create ship graveyards follow mathematical laws that pirates learned through bitter experience. Hurricanes track along predictable corridors, following ocean temperatures and wind patterns that experienced captains memorize like navigation charts. But knowing where storms travel doesn't guarantee safety. It only allows pirates to choose their risks rather than blindly stumbling into nature's traps. Salvage operations in the graveyard waters reveal the brutal efficiency with which storms destroy human ambition. Cannon that once terrorized merchant vessels now serve as anchors for fishing nets. Silver coins meant to purchase pardons for pirate crimes buy nothing from crabs that scuttle through the darkness between ribs that once protected beating hearts. The graveyard waters serve as final proof that the sea acknowledges no human law, respects no flag, and grants no mercy to those who mistake temporary success for permanent immunity. Every pirate who sails these waters knows that his ship might be the next to join the silent fleet that rests beneath the waves. Chapter 14: Storm Legends and Superstitions. The albatross circles Royal Fortune's mainmast 3 times before settling on the yardarm, and Old Tom Scuffield crosses himself with hands that have hauled rope for 40 years. Every pirate aboard knows the legend. An albatross that lands on your ship carries the soul of a drowned sailor seeking passage to the next world. Kill the bird and curse your vessel. Ignore its warning and face the storm it heralds. Pirate folklore surrounding storms blends practical observation with mystical beliefs that landlubbers dismiss as nonsense, but experienced sailors follow with religious devotion. These superstitions develop from centuries of maritime experience, compressed into memorable rules that save lives when scientific understanding fails. A red sky at morning may warn sailors of approaching weather, but the specific shade of red, the direction of cloud movement, and the behavior of seabirds provide additional layers of information that only tradition preserves. The ship's cat becomes a weather prophet whose behavior rivals any barometer for accuracy in predicting storm conditions. When Patches begins obsessively cleaning behind his ears, experienced crew members start checking the rigging for loose lines. When he hides below deck and refuses to emerge for meals, smart pirates begin securing loose cargo and preparing storm gear. Storm glass, a mixture of camphor, potassium nitrate, and ammonium chloride dissolved in distilled water, becomes the pirate navigator's crystal ball for reading nature's intentions. The crystalline formations that appear in the sealed tube supposedly predict weather changes days in advance, though modern science cannot explain how the chemical reactions respond to atmospheric pressure. Blood sacrifice traditions among Caribbean pirates involve offerings to sea gods whose names change, but whose hunger remains constant. Some crews nail silver coins to the mainmast to purchase divine protection during storms. Others pour rum into the sea while reciting the names of drowned shipmates, hoping that dead sailors will intercede with Neptune on behalf of the living. Weather witches, usually women passengers or coastal residents with reputations for supernatural insight, command respect from pirates who scoff at terrestrial authority but bow to anyone who claims power over wind and wave. These practitioners read storm signs in tea leaves, animal entrails, or the patterns made by oil floating on water. The ship's bell develops mystical significance during storm season as its tone supposedly changes when supernatural forces gather strength. A clear, pure ring indicates favorable weather, while a flat or discordant sound warns of approaching tempests. Some bells crack without explanation before major storms, requiring replacement by new bronze that must be blessed by a priest and baptized with seawater. Tattoo magic among pirate crews includes specific designs intended to provide protection during storms at sea. Anchors tattooed on the forearm supposedly prevent drowning, while compass roses on the chest ensure safe navigation through dangerous waters. Rope patterns tattooed around the wrist grant skill with knots that will hold under extreme stress. The persistence of storm superstitions among pirates reflects deeper truths about human psychology when facing forces beyond control or comprehension. Whether supernatural beliefs actually influence weather outcomes matters less than their effect on crew morale and the psychological resilience that determines survival when rational thought proves inadequate for extreme circumstances. Chapter 15: Masters of the Tempest. In the pantheon of pirate captains, few names inspire the mixture of fear and respect reserved for those who dance with hurricanes and live to tell the tale. Bartholomew Roberts earned his title Black Bart, not just through capturing 400 ships, but by surviving storms that claimed vessels larger and better equipped than his own. You watch from the quarterdeck as Roberts reads the sky like scripture, his weathered face analyzing cloud formations that would terrify lesser captains into seeking the nearest port. Jean Lafitte's legend includes tales of navigating the Louisiana bayous during hurricane season, using storm tides to reach secret bases that remained inaccessible in calm weather. Lafitte understood that the same storms which destroyed his enemy's ships could become allies for pirates who knew how to read their patterns. His reputation for supernatural weather sense came from childhood spent in the Mississippi Delta, where survival required reading the subtle signs that preceded Gulf Coast hurricanes. Shi Yang, the Chinese pirate empress who commanded 80,000 pirates across the South China Sea, built her empire partly through mastery of typhoon seasons that regular naval forces couldn't endure. Her Confederation survival during the destructive typhoons of 1805 and 1807 established her reputation as someone blessed by sea gods or cursed by demons, depending on whether you served under her flag or opposed it. Henry Morgan's greatest victory came not from his famous raid on Panama, but from his escape through a Caribbean hurricane that destroyed the Spanish fleet sent to capture him. Morgan's knowledge of storm behavior allowed him to position his ships where the hurricane circulation would drive his enemies onto reefs, while carrying his own vessels to safety. The survival techniques mastered by storm captains often involved counterintuitive decisions that violated conventional seamanship, but proved effective in extreme conditions. When lesser captains fled storms by running before the wind, masters like Roberts sometimes sailed toward the storm's edge, using its circulation to reach calmer waters more quickly than traditional escape routes allowed. And Bonny's reputation included stories of navigating storms while other captains remained in port, using her vessel's shallow draft and intimate knowledge of Caribbean currents to reach prizes that thought themselves safe from pirate attack during hurricane season. Her ability to predict storm tracks came partly from observing bird migration patterns and partly from understanding how ocean temperatures influenced hurricane development. Blackbeard's weather sense became part of his legendary status, with stories claiming he could smell hurricanes approaching days before they became visible on the horizon. Edward Teet's ability to position his fleet advantageously during the storm season of 1717 allowed him to capture vessels that sought shelter in supposedly secure harbors. The psychological qualities that separated storm masters from ordinary captains included an almost supernatural calm during crisis situations that allowed rational decision-making when panic would have been more natural. These captains developed reputations for remaining composed while ordering crew members to perform tasks that seemed suicidal but that their experience had proven necessary for survival. The legacy of storm masters extends beyond their individual achievements to include techniques and knowledge that influenced maritime practices for generations after their deaths. Naval architects incorporated their design modifications into merchant and military vessels. Navigation schools adopted their storm survival techniques as standard curriculum. Chapter 16: When the Sea Finally Wins. The morning sun illuminates a Caribbean that has returned to deceptive calm, its surface smooth as polished glass except for the debris that tells the story of last night's violence. Pieces of mast and rigging drift past like funeral flowers scattered on water that has claimed another crew, another ship, another chapter in the endless book of human ambition humbled by forces beyond mortal control. You are among the survivors, one of 12 men clinging to a makeshift raft where 48 began the night, and you know now what every pirate learns eventually. The sea always wins in the end. The mathematics of maritime survival reveal truths that no amount of courage or skill can change. For every Bartholomew Roberts who captures 400 ships, a dozen captains die in their first storm. The corpses floating nearby belong to men who believe their experience, their weapons, and their reputation made them masters of the Caribbean. Tom Halfhead, who survived the sack of Cartagena and the destruction of Port Royal, now feeds the fish that once fed him. Black Jack Morton, who escaped the gallows in 3 different ports, found his final judgment in a court that recognizes no appeals and grants no pardons. Pirates who dedicated their lives to taking what others possess discover that the ocean takes everything eventually: ships, treasure, crews, and captains alike. The gold that motivated murder disappears into depths where it serves no purpose except to weigh down the bones of those who died acquiring it. Spanish silver that funded expeditions and purchased pardons now lies scattered across the seafloor. The psychological impact of watching the sea claim victories that human enemies could never achieve changes survivors in ways that landlubbers cannot understand. Men who showed no fear while boarding enemy vessels develop profound respect for forces that cannot be intimidated, bribed, or defeated through superior violence. The ocean teaches humility to those who survive its lessons and silences those who refuse to learn. Storm seasons become annual reminders that pirate careers exist at the mercy of meteorological patterns that follow laws older than human civilization. The same winds that fill sails during successful raids can drive those sails to destruction when atmospheric conditions shift beyond human prediction or control. The irony of pirate mortality statistics shows that more crews died from weather than warfare, more captains drowned than died in battle, and more ships foundered in storms than sank from enemy action. The romantic image of pirates dying sword in hand proves false when compared to the reality of drowning helplessly in hurricanes that care nothing for reputation or fighting spirit. Colonial records from Caribbean ports document the disappearance of entire fleets during storm seasons, with vessels that sailed out never returning and crews whose fates remain unknown centuries later. These administrative footnotes represent hundreds of individual tragedies where experienced sailors faced conditions that exceeded every technique they had learned for staying alive on the water. The silence that follows storm seasons speaks louder than any tale of adventure or treasure. Empty harbors where fleets once anchored, vacant taverns where crews once celebrated, and unmarked graves in forgotten cemeteries tell the real story of piracy's golden age. Not the myth of immortal rebels, but the reality of mortal men who challenge forces that remain undefeated after consuming every challenger.